meetings. And I don't remember what the statistic is, but people spend a pretty high percentage of their day in meetings. And so being able to run an effective meeting both internally and with our clients obviously is, a pretty important skill to have. So the presentation today is basically to talk about meetings and how do we create meetings that are effective and give us where we meet the objectives of what we want to get accomplished. So my first question to the group is, why do you think it's important to have effective meetings?
Keep people's attention.
Okay.
Stay on schedule.
Stay on schedule, yeah. Well, certainly a lot of decisions and things are come about in meetings. It's really a time when you have everyone together. So being able to have an effective meeting allows you to be more nimble as far as making decisions. And how are current meetings within our organization? I don't know. How would you guys characterize our meetings? Are they good, bad, or somewhere in the middle?
I'd say they're pretty good.
Pretty good?
Yeah, I've been in a lot worse. The bigger companies, they seem to be worse.
Yeah. Ours are fairly informal, I think, when we have meetings, but certainly the more people that are in a meeting, almost the more important it is to have a better organization. So what are the keys to effective meetings? We're going to kind of go through the steps. And it's like building a house, if you think of it as a metaphor. I think to have a good meeting, you need a firm foundation. And actually 70% of the effort should go into preparing for the meeting. If you prepare well for a meeting, then the meeting itself has a much higher chance of going the way you want it to go. So we're going to be going through each one of these steps as part of this presentation. But again, I want you to think of it as building. It's not enough to just show up in a room. There's some prep work that has to occur before people even show up so that, you don't get in the meeting and find out you don't have the right people, or no one really understands what the meeting's about and they're not ready, or whatever it is. So the first part of building a good meeting is having clear objectives. And the objectives of the meeting is definitely a basis for determining who you should invite and how long the meeting should last. So for an example, if the objective is to make a decision on a certain thing, you'd want to make sure you have people in the room that can give you feedback to help you make a good decision, and you may also want the person who's the decision maker, who has the authority to make the decision, in the room. If you want to make a decision and the person who has the authority to make that decision in the room, then you're not going to be able to make a decision. So what would be some example objectives that you guys can think of for meetings? And people here in Brecksville can also chime in. What would be an example of a meeting objective? I already mentioned one, which is make a decision.
Identify cost reviews, budget reviews, or anything like that.
Right. So review information, maybe review and approve information.
That's what I was going to say.
You took Sarah's. Wow. It might be to introduce something, an idea. What else? Someone else said something?
On the sales meeting, a client has a specific need.
Right. It might be to understand, to gather information. That would be a good meeting, reason for a meeting. If we went into a meeting with a client to do a proposal, then the objective would be to get enough information that we could generate a proposal. So there's all kinds of different objectives, but the point is you want to make sure you're really clear on what the objective of the meeting is before you determine how long it's going to be and who's going to be in the meeting and what the agenda will be. Also, it's whatever the objectives are, they should be reasonable, and that should be something that you think you really could complete within the meeting. And I like to think of primary and secondary objectives. So you might say these are the two things we absolutely have to do, and here's some secondary things that if we have time we'll do. And that way you can have more objectives to get done than you could possibly get done, but you might say, as long as we get these few primary ones done, then we're good, and the secondary ones are kind of extra. So a meeting agenda the meeting agenda would be typically, if you send out a meeting agenda, which I would say is always a good thing to do before. So if I go visit, like when I went to visit Armstrong recently, I sent them a meeting agenda. I said, this is what we're going to talk about. We're going to go over what you did over the last 6 months. We're going to talk about next steps. The whole point of it is to give people an understanding of what they're going to be talking about. So that would include the meeting objectives, what the expected activities might be. If there's let's say you want to divvy it out into different time portions, you'd want to know the duration of each activity. So for example, if you're going to meet with someone, you might say, okay, we're going to have 3 hours. The first hour is going to be a general discussion. The second hour is going to be a plant tour. And the third hour is going to be a debrief and whatever it is. And then also who will present. So if you want them to be able to present certain information or certain people on the team, you want to make sure to let them know. The third thing is to have the right people. And typically, in general, you don't want more people. Meetings are very expensive, so you don't want to have 20 people in there if you only need 4. So you want to be clear on who is needed to meet the objectives of the meeting. Again, that's why you want to know the objectives. So some considerations, in some cases it might be better just to send somebody notes versus attending. You might say, it's optional for you to attend, or you don't need to attend, but we'll send you notes in the meeting so you know what happened. People with authority. It might be important to have people that have certain authority in the meeting to make decisions. And if there are certain critical people that you absolutely have to have in the meeting, you want to confirm before the meeting that they actually can attend. I don't know about you guys, but I've been in meetings before where 1 or 2 critical people were not there. And so you have a bunch of people there to discuss a topic to make a decision, and the people that need to be there to make the final decision aren't there. And in that case, you may want to, consider rescheduling the meeting. There's no reason to have it if the critical people aren't going to be able to be there. Any questions so far or comments?
Nope.
People preparation. So before the meeting, you want to let people know what to prepare for. So it might be you want them to review a report and be ready with questions, for example. So you send them some information and say, I want you to review this and come to the meeting with questions. Or we want you to present information on something. You might say, we're going to be talking about this. We would like you to present, your findings on whatever, what the downtime is or what our options are. Another one might be we want to make a decision on something, so you want to make sure to let them know to be prepared to make a decision. There might be some information you would like them to submit before the meeting. And that's one of the tricks of, making them present their information before the meeting so they don't procrastinate and not do it. If there's certain information you absolutely need for the meeting, say, well, the meeting's going to be on Monday. We'd like you to present the information that you're going to give us the information you're going to present by Friday, for example, so that we know that it's there, we have it. These are just some things. If you have assignments for people before the meeting, some ideas on things you might have them do. Now, once you have the meeting, I like to think that everyone in the meeting should have a role. And it should be an active role. People shouldn't just be in a meeting being passive. Again, that goes back to what was said before about you want to keep people engaged in the meeting. So if everybody has a role to play in the meeting and it's explicit, it's more likely that they're going to stay engaged. Some typical roles in a meeting would be the facilitator or the person running the meeting. So this would be the person who would maybe review the agenda. He would set the ground rules. He would make sure that the meeting is, moving, progressing, and meeting the objectives. That would be the facilitator. The record keeper is the person who takes notes. So if you say we want someone to take notes on what was accomplished or decisions that were made, then that would be the record keeper. Another one is the timekeeper. You might have somebody who watches the time and says, okay, we have 15 minutes to review this and we have to move on. The timekeeper would be that person that is responsible for making sure that when you get close to the end of the 15 minutes, they let you know. And then everybody else would be a participant. So participant, again, defined responsibilities of a participant. And a participant is not allowed to say or nod their head. They have to say yes or no. They have to be willing to share their ideas, should not be considered a passive role within the meeting. It should be an active role. Can anyone think of any other meeting roles that you might have? There's another one that is sometimes used depending upon the group. Any other ideas on a meeting role?
Parking lot attendant you're talking about?
There could be a parking lot attendant, someone who writes down things on the parking lot. The one I'm thinking of is called a sergeant of arms. And the sergeant of arms is responsible for making sure that everyone's following the ground rules. So if somebody's interrupting somebody else, and one of the ground rules is you're not allowed to interrupt, then the sergeant of arms is the person who explicitly has been told, hey, you need to not interrupt. That's part of our ground rule. So as you can imagine, if you're in with a very kind of caustic environment where you expect there to be trouble, you might have a sergeant of arms and say, here's our ground rules. The sergeant of arms is supposed to make sure we follow, and everybody's responsible for following it, but they're the person that reminds, we're not following the rules here. We need to follow the rules. What are some ground rules? Well, there's lots of different ground rules. Sometimes you'll even see them posted when you go into clients. They'll have a standard list of ground rules. Essentially, ground rules are agreed upon code of ethics to be enforced within a meeting. So some typical ones would be questions will be asked for clarity. So that means if you don't understand it, you need to ask questions. Confidentiality, what's said in the meeting stays in the meeting. That would be a big one in some cases. Make decisions by consensus. No one will interrupt anyone else. There was a ground rule that we came up with, and so, again, sometimes when you have adversity, you say you're not allowed to say anything until you feedback, you tell the other person what you just heard. So say someone says something, before I can give you my opinion, I have to tell you what I heard you say. And sometimes that actually helps to remove conflict because someone's really not listening, but it forces them to really listen to what the other person's saying. So if there's any kind of misunderstanding, it tends to kind of resolve that. Assigned tasks will be done on time. That could be a ground rule. Comments will be non-judgmental. And we don't make the comments about a person. We make it about a thing. Everyone will participate. I think that's a good rule. And I've had meetings where if everyone doesn't acknowledge a yes or no, I'll actually go around the room and say, I'll point to someone and say, did you say yes or no? And actually make them, acknowledge what I said. And then the final one, typical one, is meetings will start and end on time. And I know there's different methods that people use to make sure people get there on time. Mark, you've probably been in a number of meetings. What are some of the examples maybe you've seen?
For getting people there on time?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes with certain meetings, they've shut the door, and if you're not there, you don't get to come in.
Right. They'll shut the door and lock it.
I've seen that happen.
Yeah, I've seen that. Or they'll make you pay money, like you have to put a quarter in or $1 if you're late. Or I've seen various techniques to make sure people show up on time. Sometimes certain people have to show up early because they're habitually late. So you set it up where you say you have to be here 10 minutes early.
Invited people early.
Yeah, and in fact, if you go through this is actually part of our project management class. If you go through that, one of the suggestions is even if you have someone in critical who is typically late, you actually go and get them and escort them to the meeting. You actually go to their office and say, okay, let's get going to the meeting. Because if you rely on them, they won't get there or they'll get there late. Tracking meeting progress. It's quite often that I'm in a meeting where there's specific objectives, and let's say you need to make a decision, and you actually never make a decision, and you move on to the next thing. And so at the end of the day, you really don't know what you decided on. So you really need someone that tracks the meeting progress as you go through the meeting. So that would be a series of stating the objectives, and then for each objective, if you have to clarify what the objective is with people, you clarify it, you complete it, whatever that objective is, you signal when we're done, you verify that it is complete, that we make a decision, what's the decision, and then you check it off and you move on. Rather than kind of gloss over it, not really make a decision and move on to the next thing, I'm suggesting you do one thing, you finish it, cross it off, and then move on to the next one. Because I do see that happen quite a bit where, again, there might be 3 or 4 objectives to go over, and you never really get any of them crossed off. And then finally, assigning tasks. You know, a meeting is really just a time to get together, but usually there's some action items that have to be done outside the meeting. So what you want to do is make sure you review the action items at the end of the meeting. So the person who's a record keeper or taking notes, you would say, can you put together or summarize what it is that everyone agreed to? Maybe they've even put it up on the wall. Say, what were the action items that were agreed to? And then you want everyone to come up with a specific deadline and have a specific person responsible for each task. And if you're familiar with SMART goals, they're specific, measurable, actionable, results-oriented. You know, they're very specific goals, specific who's responsible, when will it be done. You want to have action items that are like that. So at the end of the meeting, everybody knows what they're responsible for, and then those should also be put into the meeting minutes. That way, when the next meeting comes around, you can go back and say, okay, based on the last meeting, this is what everybody was responsible for, and then you can use that at the beginning for the next meeting. What did people actually complete? Any questions on this?
Nope.
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 So to summarize, you know, doing a meeting, having an effective meeting is really about building it from the bottom up. So there's pre-work, identifying the objectives of the meeting, which leads you to the agenda and inviting the right people, and then preparing people for the discussion before they get together. Once you're together, it's making explicit everyone's role, whether they're the timekeeper, the facilitator, or an active participant, agreeing on ground rules if you need to, tracking the progress throughout the meeting to make sure that you are completing the objectives of the meeting before moving on, and then finally reviewing the task assignments so everyone is clear on what their responsibilities are once the meeting is over. Does anybody have any questions?
Toledo.
I don't have any questions.
No? Robin?
Nope.
Anything you'd like to add? Is there anything that we did not cover here that you think is important to have effective meetings? I mean, I just think preparation is really important. And, you know, in getting to the go-to meeting and stuff, making sure that you're ready before the meeting is also important, because whenever you use technology, sometimes things don't work. I usually try to get my computer up and running before the meeting, give myself a little extra time. If I'm using GoToMeeting, or even if I'm going to a meeting room, sometimes you find out when you get there that it's not prepared. You need a little bit of time. So I think it's important to show up a little bit early, no matter what you're doing, whether it's a GoToMeeting or whether it's an actual physical location, just to make sure that, you know, everything is the way you need it to be, whether it's the chairs in the right place or whether the computer is working properly. All right, then. Well, if nobody has any questions, that's our presentation for the week.